Clean the entire armory. Tonight. Alone. And if one bolt is out of place by morning, you pack your bags before sunrise. Sergeant Ryan Mitchell threw the rifle at her feet in front of 14 men who laughed without hesitation. Nobody stopped him. Not one person in that room said a word in her defense. They expected tears. They expected her to break. They expected exactly what they always expected from someone they had already decided didn't belong. What they got instead was 2 words delivered in a voice so calm it was almost frightening. Yes, Sergeant. They had no idea they had just handed the most dangerous person in the building exactly what she needed. Before we go any further, if this story already has you feeling something, drop a comment right now and tell me what city you are watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Subscribe to this channel and stay with me until the very end, because what happens next is something none of those men in that room will ever forget for the rest of their lives. She didn't flinch. That was the first thing Ryan Mitchell noticed, though he would never admit it out loud. He had thrown that rifle expecting a gasp, a stumble, maybe even a few tears. He had done it in front of 14 operators who had each spent years earning their place in this room through blood, sweat, broken bones, and missions that never appeared in any newspaper. He had done it because he could, because nobody was going to stop him, because in his mind, she didn't belong here. And the fastest way to prove that was to make her feel it in her bones the very first minute she walked through that door. But Lieutenant Madison Carter didn't gasp. She didn't stumble. She looked down at the rifle on the floor, then looked back up at Mitchell, and her face was completely terrifyingly calm. Yes, Sergeant, she said 2 words. No trembling in her voice. No heat behind her eyes, just 2 words delivered like she had already accepted something the rest of the room hadn't figured out yet. Mitchell almost said something else, almost pushed further, but something about the way she answered stopped him, and he wasn't sure why, and that bothered him more than he wanted to admit. He turned away and told himself it was nothing. He was wrong, but we'll get to that. First, you need to understand what kind of room Madison Carter walked into that morning, because this wasn't just any military unit. This wasn't a standard naval office where rank and paperwork settled arguments. This was Naval Special Warfare Detachment, 7, a unit so classified that most people inside the broader military structure didn't even know its full mission parameters. The men assigned here had been selected through one of the most brutal vetting processes in the entire American military. They had been tested in environments designed to make them quit. They had been pushed past the point where most human beings stopped functioning. And they had survived. Every single one of them had earned the right to stand in this building through years of proving that they would not break. So when an unknown female lieutenant arrived with a transfer order signed by authorities that none of them recognized, it didn't feel like a welcome addition to the team. It felt like a threat. Commander Ethan Whitmore read her file twice before she arrived. Or more accurately, he tried to read her file. Because what he found wasn't impressive credentials or a long list of decorated accomplishments. What he found was almost nothing. Her name, her rank, her age, 28 years old. A few routine training certifications that any junior officer could accumulate in 3 years of standard service. And then a transfer order marked with a classification level that made Whitmore's jaw tighten. He had seen that classification level before, once. A long time ago, on a document he had spent years trying to forget. He didn't say anything about that to his men. Not yet. He wasn't even sure what to make of it himself. So he did what he always did when something felt wrong. He waited. He watched. He let the situation develop before he made any decisions. What he didn't account for was Ryan Mitchell making the decision for him. Madison had walked into the briefing room at exactly 7 in the morning. She was in standard naval officer attire, her dark hair pulled back in a tight regulation style, her posture straight without being stiff. The room had gone quiet when she entered, but it wasn't a respectful quiet. It was the kind of quiet that happens when a group of people are deciding something about you before you've opened your mouth. She stood near the doorway and waited. Nobody moved to greet her. Nobody gestured toward an empty seat. Nobody made any kind of introduction. 14 operators just stared at her the way they stared at everything they hadn't decided to trust yet. Mitchell was the one who broke the silence. "You lost," he said. A few quiet laughs from the back of the room. Not loud, just enough to let her know where she stood. "Lieutenant Madison Carter," she said, "transfer order, reporting to Commander Whitmore." "Commander Whitmore isn't here yet," Mitchell said, So right now you're reporting to this room, and this room wants to know what you're doing here. She met his eyes and held them. I'm assigned here. Assigned, Mitchell repeated like the word had a bad taste. He glanced at the men around him, then back at her. Honey, every man in this room was assigned here after proving they belong. You want to tell me what you did to prove that? She didn't answer. That was the wrong move in Mitchell's estimation. In his world, silence was either weakness or arrogance, and neither was acceptable from someone who hadn't earned the right to be arrogant yet. So he crossed the room, picked up the heaviest unassigned rifle from the rack along the wall, walked back toward her, and dropped it at her feet. The armory, he said, every weapon, every record. Tonight, alone, he leaned in slightly. And if one bolt is out of place when I check it in the morning, you go back to wherever they pulled you from. The room waited, and she said, yes, Sergeant. And Mitchell walked away feeling like he had won something. He hadn't. He had just handed her the most important room in the building and told her to spend the night alone inside it. Commander Whitmore arrived 30 minutes later and was told what happened. He stood in his office doorway, listening to the account with his hands clasped behind his back, his face giving nothing away. When the report was finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Where is she now? He asked. Armory. And Mitchell, off duty, said it was handled. Whitmore nodded slowly. Then he said, nobody goes near the armory tonight. The operator giving the report looked up. Sir, I said nobody goes near the armory tonight. He turned and walked into his office and closed the door quietly behind him. Nobody understood what that meant. Not yet. Danny Brooks was 24 years old, the youngest operator currently assigned to the unit, and he had two personal rules that he lived by. First, never do anything that makes the team look bad. Second, never miss an opportunity to learn something. He was also, if he was being completely honest with himself, a little bit haunted by the look on Lieutenant Carter's face when Mitchell dropped that rifle at her feet, because he had expected her to look scared, or angry, or humiliated. And she hadn't looked like any of those things. She had looked like someone who had been given exactly what they expected and was already several steps ahead of how to use it. That bothered him in a way he couldn't quite name. So at 11:30 that night, despite Commander Whitmore's instruction, Danny Brooks walked quietly down the corridor toward the armory. He told himself he was just going to check on her, not help her, just look, just satisfy the nagging feeling in his chest that something about this situation was different from what everyone else in the unit thought it was. He stood outside the armory door for a moment before pushing it open. The room was brightly lit. Every surface of the long metal workbenches was organized with a precision that immediately caught his attention because the armory under normal conditions was maintained well enough to pass inspection, but it was never like this. Tools were arranged in exact parallel lines. Every clean component had been placed in documented order. The record books were open, filled with annotations in a handwriting so exact and deliberate it barely looked human. And then he saw Madison. She was sitting at the center bench with a disassembled rifle in front of her, and her eyes were closed. Her hands were moving. That was the part that stopped Danny cold in the doorway. Her hands were moving across the disassembled components of that rifle with perfect fluid confidence, and her eyes were completely shut. Not resting, not struggling to stay awake. Closed like she was listening to music only she could hear, while her fingers found each part by memory, by instinct, by some internal knowledge of the weapon that had nothing to do with looking at it. She was reassembling the rifle without seeing it, and she was doing it faster than most of the men in the unit could do it, with both eyes open. And Danny stood in the doorway for almost a full minute before he realized he hadn't taken a breath. He exhaled quietly and Madison's eyes opened. She didn't turn around immediately. She finished the final sequence on the rifle, set it down, then turned and looked at him standing in the doorway. You're Danny Brooks, she said. You've been with this unit for 14 months. He blinked. How do you know that? Because you do everything right, she said. Your gear is always squared away. Your reports are always on time. You hold the door for the personnel staff even though nobody else does. You've been here 14 months and you still do all the things they told you to do before you got here, before the other habits kicked in. That kind of consistency doesn't happen by accident. It means you care about being here. Danny didn't know what to say to that. You're the youngest one here, she continued, not unkindly. That means you spend a lot of time watching and not enough time being watched, which means when you saw something you didn't understand tonight, you came to look instead of assuming you already knew. She turned back to the workbench and picked up the next weapon. Danny found his voice. You do that with your eyes closed. The disassembly. Reassembly, she corrected quietly. Can you do both? She picked up the rifle she had just reassembled, closed her eyes again, and in 21 seconds, without looking, broke it down into every component. Then she set the pieces down in perfect order. Danny felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Where did you learn that? He asked. She didn't answer. She just opened her eyes and looked at the next rifle in line. And Danny understood, in the way that young people sometimes understand things they're not fully equipped to process yet, that the woman sitting at that workbench was not what anyone in this unit thought she was. He didn't know what she was. He didn't have the context yet. But he understood that whatever story Commander Whitmore hadn't told them about Lieutenant Madison Carter was not a small story. He left the armory quietly and went back to his quarters and didn't sleep for the rest of the night. In the morning, Master Chief William Hayes conducted the inspection. Hayes was 51 years old and in a building full of elite operators. He was the one even the most decorated men treated with a specific kind of reverence. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't tell stories. He didn't make speeches. He simply had a way of looking at situations that cut through everything irrelevant and saw exactly what was real. 31 years of service, deployments on 5 continents. He had seen things that changed a man permanently, and those experiences had given him a quality of attention that bordered on unsettling. He noticed things other people didn't notice. He always had. And this morning he was going to inspect the armory work done by the new lieutenant, who everyone already expected to fail. He walked in at 6 a.m. He walked out 38 minutes later. He went directly to Commander Whitmore's office and knocked once. Come in. Hayes entered and stood in front of the desk. Whitmore was already behind it, coffee in hand, looking like a man who hadn't slept much either. The armory, Hayes said. Whitmore waited. She found the tension spring fault on the M4 that 3 separate maintenance checks missed over the past 6 weeks, Hayes said. His voice was completely level. She caught a firing pin wear issue on number 7 that wasn't in any report and would have failed under live fire conditions within the next 90 rounds. She also recatalogued 17 entries in the maintenance record that had been logged incorrectly since February. He paused. The work is better than anything I've seen out of this unit in 2 years. Whitmore set down his coffee. And, Hayes continued, she annotated each correction with the specific regulation reference in the potential failure scenario. Not just what was wrong, why it was wrong, and what would have happened in the field if it stayed wrong. The office was quiet. Master Chief, Whitmore finally said, how long would it take an experienced operator to do what she did last night? Hayes thought about it. Working alone straight through without breaks, 40 hours minimum, maybe 50. Whitmore looked at the clock on his wall. She had 9. Neither of them said anything. Then Hayes put a piece of paper on the desk. Found this in the record book. She wrote it herself. Whitmore picked it up. On it, in that precise, deliberate handwriting, was a single line below the final entry. All deficiencies corrected. No further personnel injury risk. Tool and weapon integrity confirmed to operational standard. Carter M., not Lieutenant Carter, not Officer Carter, just Carter. Whitmore stared at that name for a long time, Carter. I knew that name. He knew it in the way you know certain things that have been buried for years. You don't think about them every day. But the moment you see them again, everything comes back at once, Daniel Carter. He could see the man's face as clearly now as the day they met during workup more than 20 years ago. Daniel Carter, who could disassemble any weapon in the inventory with his eyes closed. Daniel Carter, who caught things other operators missed because he saw weapons not as tools but as systems, and systems didn't lie. Daniel Carter, who had served with absolute dedication until one disastrous night when everything went wrong and a report came down that blamed him for a mission failure that shattered the careers of everyone around it. Daniel Carter, who never recovered from that, who died 2 years later, quietly without ceremony, carrying the weight of something that those who knew him had always suspected he didn't deserve. Whitmore set the paper down. What was the father's name? He asked quietly. Hayes met his eyes. I wondered when you'd get there. William. Sir, I need to know everything we have on her transfer order. Already pulled it. Hayes put a second sheet on the desk. authorized by a classification level that only 5 active positions in the entire Naval Special Warfare Command structure can sign off on. The kind of authorization you only use when something has to happen quietly and officially at the same time. Whitmore stared at the sheet. She didn't come here through normal channels. No, sir. Then who sent her? Hayes was quiet for a moment. Then, I don't think that's the right question. Whitmore looked up. The right question, Hayes said slowly, is why someone with her level of skill and her family history and a classified transfer authorization is sitting in our armory doing punishment detail while our people laugh at her. The silence that followed that question was the kind that fills a room completely. Mitchell, Whitmore said. He doesn't know, Hayes said carefully. Nobody knows. That's the point. That's not a defense. No, Hayes agreed. It's not. Whitmore stood up. He walked to the window and looked out at the base at the rain that had started again overnight and was still coming down steadily across the gray courtyard. His team was out there. Men he had trained with, deployed with, trusted with his life. Men who had laughed at a young woman the night before without knowing a single true thing about her. Without asking a single real question. He thought about Daniel Carter. I thought about the report that had destroyed that man's career. He thought about how the people in that report had trusted information they were given without questioning where it came from. He turned around. Get Mitchell in here, he said. What are you going to say to him? Whitmore picked up his coffee. I don't know yet. He looked down at the single word on that paper again. Carter. But I know someone who could tell me what I need to know. He walked to the door. And she's probably still in the armory, he said. Hayes watched him go. Then he looked at the paper on the desk for a long moment at that precise, deliberate name, written by a hand that had spent years learning how to do everything its father could do in honor of something nobody had ever properly honored. He had been in this business for 31 years. He had seen betrayal. He had seen loyalty. He had seen men rise and men fall, and men carry burdens in silence that would have broken someone else long before they broke them. But something about this situation, about this young woman, sitting alone in an armory doing work that experts would call impossible, about the quiet way she had said yes, Sergeant, to the man who mocked her, about the name written at the bottom of a maintenance log, like a quiet signature, on a letter that had been waiting 20 years to be delivered. Something about all of it made the back of Master Chief William Hayes's neck feel cold. Hun had learned in 3 decades of this work to pay very close attention to that feeling. He picked up his cap and followed the commander out. Mitchell was in the equipment bay when the summons came. He was with 3 other operators running through gear checks, talking in the easy shorthand of men who had worked together long enough to stop needing full sentences. When the young specialist told him the commander wanted him in the office, he shrugged and handed off what he was working on and walked without urgency. I wasn't worried. Why would he be? He hadn't done anything wrong. The new lieutenant was a problem, and he had addressed the problem. That was his job. That was what the unit needed him to do. You didn't let standards slip because someone arrived with a mysterious transfer order and a face that looked like she'd never seen a difficult day in her life. He knocked on the commander's office door. Enter. He came in and immediately noticed 2 things. First, Hayes was standing against the far wall, which was unusual. Hayes didn't usually attend individual meetings. Second, Commander Whitmore was not sitting at his desk. He was standing in front of it, arms at his sides, and his expression was the one Mitchell privately called the pre-storm face. The face Whitmore made when he was choosing his words with extreme care because the alternative was something he wasn't willing to do. Sir, Mitchell said, coming to attention. Ryan, Whitmore said, using his first name. That was new. Sir, tell me exactly what you said to Lieutenant Carter when she reported in yesterday morning. Mitchell kept his posture steady. I gave her a work assignment, Commander. Standard assessment for a new unit member without an established. That's not what I asked you, Whitmore said quietly. I asked you exactly what you said. Mitchell recounted it. Exactly, because he wasn't going to lie to this man, and he wasn't ashamed of what he'd done. He had said what needed to be said and done what needed to be done, and the armory work would either support that decision or it wouldn't. When he finished, the office was quiet. She said yes, Sergeant, Hayes said from the wall. His voice was perfectly neutral. That's all she said. That's right, Mitchell confirmed. She didn't argue, Hayes continued. She didn't question the authority of the order. She didn't go above you to the commander. She accepted the assignment. Correct. And this morning, Whitmore said, Master Chief Hayes found work in that armory that would take an experienced operator with full resources approximately 40 to 50 hours to complete. He let that land. She had 9 hours, alone, with no support. Mitchell's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes shifted very slightly. She also, Whitmore continued, identified critical maintenance failures that 3 separate inspections missed. Failures that would have resulted in weapon malfunction under live fire conditions. He stepped forward 1 step. Our weapons, Ryan, our people's weapons. Mitchell said nothing. The question I have for you, Whitmore said carefully, is not whether your instinct to test a new team member is reasonable. It is. The question is what you plan to do with the information that your test produced a result you were not expecting. The room waited. Mitchell looked at the floor for a moment, then back up. I underestimated her, he said. The words came out harder than he intended, like something that cost him something real to say. That's a start, Hayes said. The question, Whitmore said again, is what you do with that. And Mitchell, who had spent more than 15 years in the most demanding environment the American military produced, who had never once in his career backed away from being wrong, when being wrong was the truth, stood in that office and made a decision that would change everything that came after. I want to apologize to her, he said, directly, not through you, not through a memo, face to face. Whitmore looked at him for a long moment. That's not the only thing you're going to need to do, he said. Mitchell nodded. He understood. He didn't know exactly what was coming yet. He didn't know the full story about the woman in the armory, or what her last name meant, or what was underneath the surface of her quiet presence in this unit. He just knew that he had been wrong, and that being wrong in this environment, in this team, with what this team stood for, that had consequences. Real ones. When do I talk to her, he asked. Not yet, Whitmore said. Mitchell looked up. Sir, not yet, Whitmore repeated. And something in his voice carried a weight that wasn't about yesterday morning in the briefing room. Something older and heavier. There are things I need to understand first. He walked back to his desk and sat down and picked up the piece of paper with the single name written at the bottom in precise, deliberate handwriting. Carter. He had trusted a system once. He had trusted a report once. He had let one name be erased because the paperwork said it was right, and the people around him didn't push back, and he didn't push back either. And that man had carried the weight of something he didn't deserve all the way to the end of his life. He was not going to make that mistake again. Not when that man's daughter had walked into his armory alone at night and worked until every single deficiency was corrected and signed her name at the bottom, not with a rank, not with a title, but with the only name that mattered to her in this world. He looked at the door. Somewhere on the other side of this building, Lieutenant Madison Carter had finished the assignment that was supposed to break her, and she was probably already back in position, waiting, watching, being underestimated, and knowing exactly what she was doing. He just didn't know why yet, but he was going to find out. Because in 30 years of service, Commander Ethan Whitmore had learned one thing above everything else. When you keep meeting quiet people in places where quiet people don't usually survive, you stop assuming the quiet is weakness. You start asking what they're listening for. And the answer more often than not is something everyone else in the room stopped hearing a long time ago. He set the paper down. He folded his hands on the desk. And he started asking himself a question that he should have asked the moment that transfer order arrived on his desk with a classification level he hadn't seen in 20 years. Not who is she, not why is she here, but who is she protecting and what are they afraid she's going to find? Commander Ethan Whitmore did not sleep that night. He sat behind his desk long after the base went quiet, long after the last light in the corridor outside his office clicked off, and he read the maintenance log that Madison Carter had completed with the same slow, careful attention he gave to mission briefs before a high-risk operation. He read every annotation, every correction reference, every notation about why a particular deficiency was dangerous and what the exact failure scenario would look like in the field. He read it twice, then a third time. Then he put it down and stared at the wall. He had spent 30 years in this business telling himself that the system was imperfect, but fundamentally trustworthy. That the reports were incomplete sometimes, but not dishonest. That when something went wrong, it was usually because of chaos and pressure, and human error under impossible conditions, not because someone made a deliberate choice to let an innocent man carry the blame for something he didn't do. Daniel Carter. He pressed two fingers against his temple and made himself go back to that night, 22 years ago, a mission in a country he wasn't allowed to name in any document that would ever be filed publicly. A mission that was supposed to be clean and precise and was instead a catastrophe from the first hour. 11 operators on the ground. Communications cut early. The intelligence package they had been given turned out to be wrong in the most critical possible way, and by the time anyone understood what was happening, 2 men were dead. The objective was lost, and everyone who survived was trying to figure out how to explain what had gone wrong without destroying the unit. And then the report came down, and the report said it was Carter, faulty assessment on the ground, authorized deviation from protocol, individual decision-making that compromised the overall mission integrity. Whitmore had read that report and felt something cold and uncertain move through him because Daniel Carter was the last person he would have pointed to as the weak link in that chain. Carter was methodical. Carter was precise. Carter was the man who could close his eyes in a room full of weapons and tell you by touch alone which ones would fail and which ones would hold. But the report was official. The signatures were real. The evidence cited was detailed enough to look convincing if you didn't look too hard at the gaps between the facts. And Whitmore, 22 years old, inside a system he had given everything to, had not looked hard enough at the gaps. He had let it go. He had told himself he was trusting the process. And Daniel Carter had spent the next 2 years quietly falling apart, discharged with a record that made reintegration nearly impossible, dead before his 40th birthday from causes that everyone in the community understood without saying out loud. Whitmore put both hands flat on the desk. The woman sleeping somewhere in this building right now, who had spent 9 hours doing the impossible alone in an armory because a sergeant wanted to humiliate her, was Daniel Carter's daughter. The question was not whether she knew. The question was what she had found. At 6:15 the next morning, Whitmore went to find her himself. She was in the equipment bay, not the armory which she had finished, not the common area where most of the unit had breakfast before morning briefings. The equipment bay, which was where operational gear was maintained and staged. She was at the far end of it, alone, going through load-bearing vests with the same methodical, unhurried precision she had applied to the weapons the night before. Checking straps, checking buckle integrity, checking the small details that accumulated into the difference between a piece of gear that worked under pressure and one that didn't. Nobody had assigned her to the equipment bay. She had just found the next thing that needed attention and started working on it. Whitmore stood at the bay entrance and watched her for a moment without announcing himself. Then he said, "Lieutenant Carter." She turned immediately, no startled reaction, like she had already known he was there. "Commander Whitmore," she said. She came to attention. At ease. He walked forward, hands behind his back, moving slowly in the way he moved when he was thinking hard about something at the same time he was doing something else. He stopped a few feet away from her and looked at the gear laid out on the bench. Then he looked at her. "How long have you been awake?" "Since 0300, sir." That meant she had gotten perhaps 3 hours of sleep after finishing the armory work. If that. "You weren't assigned to this bay," he said. "No, sir. But you're here." "There was work to be done, sir." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that she clearly had not expected, because it was the first thing that produced any visible change in her expression since she had arrived at this unit. He said, "Tell me about your father." She was absolutely still for 3 full seconds. Her face didn't collapse, didn't harden, didn't do any of the things faces do when someone is caught off guard and trying to recover. She just went very, very still, like an athlete absorbing impact, taking the weight of something and redistributing it before responding. Then she said, "What do you want to know, sir?" "The truth," he said. "Whatever version of it you came here carrying." She looked at him for a long moment, measuring him, deciding something. Then she turned back to the bench and picked up a vest, turned it over in her hands and began to talk. "My father talked about you," she said. "Not about the mission. He never talked about the mission, but he talked about you specifically. Said you were the kind of officer who paid attention to what was actually in front of you instead of what someone told you was in front of you." She paused. He respected that. Whitmore said nothing. "He died when I was 19, she continued. "I had been in ROTC for a year. I was already planning to serve. After he died, the plan didn't change. It just got a different purpose underneath it, which was, she set the vest down and turned to face him directly. He didn't fail that mission, Commander. You know that, I know that, and somewhere in this building's history, the documentation that proves it still exists. The air between them was completely still. That's a significant claim, Whitmore said. It's not a claim, she said. It's the conclusion of 7 years of work. She held his gaze without aggression, without challenge, with only the flat certainty of someone who has been sitting with evidence long enough that the uncertainty burned off years ago. Someone in the command structure provided a manipulated intelligence package to that mission. Not wrong intelligence, deliberately wrong intelligence. Adjusted before it reached the ground team to ensure the objective would be compromised. And when it was compromised, the false report that followed was prepared in advance. My father's name was already in it before the debrief happened. Whitmore felt something shift in his chest, a cold, slow recognition. Why are you telling me this? He asked, carefully, not skeptically, carefully. Because the same pattern is appearing again, she said. In the lead up to the operation, this unit is currently preparing for the intelligence package, has 3 structural anomalies that match the one from 22 years ago. Not similar, matching, same source architecture, same redaction pattern around the critical decision points, same gap in the verification chain. She looked at him steadily. Whoever did this to my father is still inside this system, and they are setting up your team to take the next fall. The silence lasted a long time. Whitmore was not a man who startled easily. He was not a man who made fast emotional decisions about information he had just received. He processed things the way he had been trained to process them, methodically, without panic. But what he felt standing in that equipment bay was not shock exactly. It was the specific, nauseating sensation of a pattern completing itself. Of 2 data points that had lived separately in his mind for 2 decades, suddenly snapping together into the shape they had always been. He said, "Who authorized your transfer to this unit?" She said, "I think you already know the answer to that, sir." He did. He had seen the classification level on the order. 5 positions in the entire Naval Special Warfare Command could sign off at that level. He could eliminate 3 of them based on retirement timelines. That left 2, and one of those 2 was a person he trusted completely, which meant it was the other one. He would not ask her to confirm it right now. Not because he was afraid of the answer, because he needed to verify it himself before he acted on it. That was the discipline that had kept him and his people alive for 30 years. You did not move on something this significant based on a single conversation, no matter how convincing. "Lieutenant Carter," he said, "Sir, what you've described to me this morning has serious implications for this unit and for an active operational timeline." He chose his words precisely. "I am not dismissing what you've said, but I also cannot act unilaterally on information I haven't verified through my own channels." "I understand that, sir," she said immediately. "That's exactly what I would expect you to say. And I want to give you time to do that." She paused. "But the operational timeline is not flexible. The window where the pattern can still be interrupted is approximately 12 days. 12 days. Whitmore held her gaze. "In the meantime," he said, "how do you want to proceed inside this unit?" She surprised him again, because she said without hesitation, "Exactly the same way I have been." He frowned. Meaning nobody finds out anything has changed," she said. "I carry equipment. I take the least important seat in meetings. I do the work nobody else wants to do, and I don't explain myself." She looked at him with those calm, serious eyes that were so much like her father's that it was momentarily disorienting. "If whoever set this up has a source inside your unit, and I believe they do, then changing my status alerts them. They adjust, the window closes. We lose the opportunity to catch them in the mechanism." "You want to stay underestimated," Whitmore said slowly. "I need to stay underestimated," she said, "until I don't." Another long silence. "That means Mitchell stays in the dark," he said. "Mitchell brooks everyone, except you and Master Chief Hayes." "Hayes," he repeated. He hadn't said Hayes' name. She met his eyes without blinking. "My father mentioned him too." Whitmore exhaled slowly through his nose. Then he said, "This is a significant amount of trust to ask from someone who met you yesterday." She nodded. "I know. And I'm not asking you to trust me, Commander. I'm asking you to trust the work I left in that armory last night. The evidence is in the details. It always has been. She picked up the load-bearing vest again and turned back to the bench. Take the time you need. I'll be here. He stood there for another moment, looking at the back of her head, at the precise and deliberate way her hands moved across the gear on that bench. Then he turned and walked out of the bay. He went directly to Master Chief Hayes' quarters and knocked. Hayes answered the door, already dressed. He hadn't slept much either. Whitmore could see it in the slight compression around his eyes. I need you to pull everything we have on the pre-operational intelligence package for November's assignment, Whitmore said. Not the summary, the raw package, every source document and every verification chain. Hayes looked at him for 2 seconds. What am I looking for? Structural anomalies, source architecture, redaction patterns around critical decision nodes. Hayes was quiet for exactly 3 beats. Then, this is about her. Pull the package, Whitmore said. I'll explain when you've seen it yourself. He needed Hayes to see it without being told what he was looking for. Because if Hayes found the same anomalies independently, without any leading information, then the pattern was real. And if it was real, then everything Madison Carter had said in that equipment bay was not the grief-driven theory of a daughter who couldn't accept her father's failures. It was evidence. Hayes pulled the package. It took him 4 hours. He came back to Whitmore's office at noon and stood in the doorway with a face that had a specific controlled quality to it that Whitmore recognized as the face Hayes made when he was deciding whether to say what he was thinking. Sit down, William, Whitmore said. Hayes sat. He put a folder on the desk. He looked at the commander. 3 anomalies, he said, same structural signature. The verification chain on the primary source document breaks at the same tier as. He stopped. Then he said, as the mission package from 22 years ago. The air in the room was very heavy. I pulled the old package from the archive, Hayes said quietly. The one I wasn't supposed to still have a copy of. He looked at the folder on the desk. I've been carrying it for 20 years because I never quite believed the report was clean, and I never knew what to do with that feeling. Whitmore stared at him. The overlap is not coincidental, Ethan, Hayes said, using his first name the way he only did when the situation was beyond the formal register. Someone is using the same mechanism, same source redaction technique, same gap in the chain of custody documentation at the critical decision point. The details are different because the mission is different, but the architecture is the same. Same architect, Whitmore said. Same architect, Hayes confirmed. They looked at each other across the desk. She told me 12 days, Whitmore said. She told you, Hayes said. Not a question, a statement of careful understanding. She told you about the anomalies. She told me everything. Hayes was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that surprised Whitmore given how skeptical Hayes had been during their conversation earlier. She's right about staying underestimated, he said. If there's a source inside the unit, they have to believe nothing has changed. The moment she becomes officially credible in here, the mechanism adjusts. We lose the trail. You came to the same conclusion she did. She came to it first, Hayes said. I'm just confirming it. He put his hand on the folder. Daniel Carter was the most detail-oriented operator I ever served alongside. His daughter just spent 9 hours alone in an armory, doing work at a level most professionals couldn't match with full support and unlimited time. He met Whitmore's eyes. She's not here on a theory. She's been working this for 7 years. We're the last piece. Whitmore pressed his hands together. Ryan Mitchell came looking for Madison that afternoon. Not because anyone told him to, not because the commander had given him a new directive. He came looking for her because he had been sitting with the information Hayes had shared at the morning meeting about the armory work, and he had the uncomfortable, persistent feeling of a man who owed a debt he hadn't paid and didn't like the feeling. He found her in the vehicle maintenance area, not because she had been assigned there either, which Mitchell noticed immediately. She was checking fluid levels and running systematic diagnostics on a vehicle that had 3 separate mechanic sign-offs from the previous week. Nobody had asked her to check behind the mechanics. She was just doing it because she had apparently identified a gap in the standard operating process and decided to fill it without making any announcement about the fact that she was doing so. Mitchell stood at the entrance for a moment. She didn't turn around. I know you're there, she said without looking up from what she was doing. You're not subtle. Mitchell blinked, then he walked in. He stopped about 6 feet behind her and crossed his arms, then uncrossed them because crossing his arms was a defensive posture, and he was not here to defend himself. He was here to do something harder. The armory work, he said, is finished, she said. Master Chief Hayes described what you did in there as better than anything this unit has produced in 2 years. She kept working. Master Chief Hayes is generous. He's not, Mitchell said flatly. He's the most exacting person I've ever worked for, and he does not make allowances for sentiment. If he said that, he meant it exactly. She paused for just a moment, then continued. Lieutenant, Mitchell said. He said it differently than he had said it the day before. It cost him something this time, which was exactly the right way for it to cost him. I owe you an apology. She turned around then. She looked at him with that same steady, calm expression, and he searched it for something: triumph, resentment, the understandable satisfaction of being owed something by someone who had mocked you in front of 14 people, and he found none of those things. What he found was something quieter and more serious. Sergeant Mitchell, she said, I don't need your apology. He frowned. I was wrong. I made assumptions, and I acted on them in a way that was unprofessional, and I know, she said. I heard you, but that's not what I'm saying. She tilted her head slightly, a gesture that felt less like condescension and more like someone choosing their words with genuine care. I'm saying I don't need it. What you did yesterday gave me 9 uninterrupted hours in the most information-rich room in this building. I had complete access to your unit's weapon systems, maintenance history, and operational readiness baseline. She let that land. If you had welcomed me into a briefing and given me a desk and a cup of coffee, I wouldn't have had that. Mitchell was completely still. The armory told me more about the real condition of this unit than 3 months of standard observation would have, she said. So while I understand and accept the spirit of what you're trying to say, I want you to understand that from where I was standing yesterday was exactly what it needed to be. He stared at her for a long moment. Then he said, Who are you? And she looked at him with her father's eyes, in her father's way, with the same quality of attention that Daniel Carter had turned on problems that everybody else had stopped looking at. I'm the person who's going to make sure your team comes home from the operation that's coming, she said. That's all you need to know right now. Something happened to Ryan Mitchell's face in that moment. It was a small thing, an almost invisible reorganization of expression in a man who had trained for years to control his face under conditions that would break most people. But it was real. It happened. And what it looked like, if you were standing close enough to see it, was the particular shift a person goes through when they realize they were standing inside the wrong version of the story and have just been shown the door to the right one. He uncrossed his arms. He nodded once. He walked out of the vehicle bay. He didn't tell anyone she'd said, not because he was ordered not to, because he understood in the way that capable people understand things without being told that silence was the right tool for this moment. But something had changed in Ryan Mitchell, something that would matter later, something that started right there in a vehicle bay with a lieutenant who didn't need his apology. Danny Brooks found out about the armory work the way most information spread in this unit, which was through Master Chief Hayes mentioning it once in a tone that allowed no further discussion during the late morning briefing, as a single factual statement without editorial commentary. Lieutenant Carter's armory assessment identified 3 critical maintenance deficiencies that prior inspections missed. The corrections have been implemented. All weapon systems are now certified to operational standard. And then he moved on to the next item. The room was quiet for exactly 2 seconds too long after that. Danny felt the quiet land differently on him than it landed on the others because he had been in that armory the night before. He had seen what she was doing. He had watched her reassemble a weapon with her eyes closed in under 25 seconds. He had gone back to his quarters and not slept and spent the pre-dawn hours thinking about what kind of person could do what she was doing and why she would choose to do it this way quietly without making any statement about her own capabilities, letting the work speak while she stayed silent. Now hearing Hayes describe the outcome to a room full of operators who had laughed at her the day before, Danny felt something he couldn't quite categorize. It wasn't satisfaction exactly. It was more like the feeling you get when you've been watching something you didn't understand, and then suddenly the angle shifts and you understand it completely, and the understanding is both clarifying and a little humbling. He went looking for her that evening. He found her in the narrow corridor outside the records room, going through a filing system that, as far as Danny knew, Nobody had touched in months. She was sitting cross-legged on the floor with a stack of maintenance records in her lap, reading through them with the same quality of focused attention she gave everything. "You don't sleep," he said. She looked up. "I sleep. When, when there's nothing more useful to do." She turned a page. "Sit down, Danny." He sat on the floor across from her, back against the wall. It was the most informal position he had been in with a superior officer in his entire career, and it felt oddly, completely appropriate. "You knew about the weapon failures before you started working last night," he said. Not a question. She glanced at him. "What makes you say that?" "Because the way you moved through the armory wasn't someone discovering problems as they went. It was someone confirming things they already suspected." He watched her face. "You came in with a list in your head." She was quiet for a moment. "Then you're more observant than people give you credit for." "I get that a lot," he said without any lightness. "Usually right before someone explains to me why what I observe doesn't matter." She looked at him then with something that shifted in her expression. Not pity, recognition. "It matters," she said. "What you observed, what you notice, what you're willing to say out loud when other people have already decided the conversation is over, that matters enormously. In this specific situation and in general." She turned another page. "There are people in this unit who are more decorated than you, more experienced, more senior. But experience and decoration tell you what a person has survived. They don't tell you how they think." She paused. "How you think is more important than what you've done, eventually." Danny looked at the stack of records. "What are you looking for in those?" She looked at him steadily. For a moment, he thought she wasn't going to answer. Then she said, "Patterns. In the maintenance records." "In everything," as she said. "Maintenance records, personnel logs, assignment histories. Patterns in what gets documented and patterns in what doesn't. Patterns in what was inspected and when, and patterns in what was consistently not inspected despite being on the schedule." She looked back at the page in her hand. "People think deception is about hiding things. It's not. It's about creating a rhythm that looks normal. A false normal that nobody questions because it's been there long enough to feel like background noise." She turned the page. "You find deception by finding the places where the rhythm is slightly off." "Oh, my God, Danny was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Is the rhythm off somewhere in this unit?" She didn't look up. She said, "I need you to do something for me, and I need you to do it without asking why yet." Danny's pulse moved slightly faster. "What?" "In the next 48 hours, you're going to receive a request for information about the November operation. It's going to come through a channel that seems routine. It's going to feel like a standard coordination request." She turned a page. "When it comes, I need you to log it." "Exactly. Time source content, the exact phrasing of the request. Don't respond to it immediately. Tell them you're confirming details and we'll follow up. Then bring the log to me." He stared at her. "You know a specific request is coming." "I know the pattern," she said. "How long have you known the pattern?" She looked up at him. Then in her eyes had something in them that was not quite sadness and not quite hardness, but lived somewhere in the space between the two. The place where grief goes when a person has been working with it long enough to stop letting it paralyze them and started letting it focus them instead. "A long time," she said. Danny said, "Is someone in this unit the source of the pattern?" She held his gaze. She didn't answer. And the fact that she didn't answer was itself an answer, and Danny felt the floor of the situation shift underneath him, the way floors shift when you've been walking on something solid. And it turns out the solidity was constructed, and below it is something much more complicated. He said, "Okay." Just that, one word. He didn't ask her to explain more. He didn't ask her to justify the request. He didn't tell her he would do it if she gave him more information first. He just said, "Okay," because he was 24 years old and had been in this unit 14 months, doing everything right, even when nobody was watching, and he understood in the place where instinct and training meet that this was a moment that called for exactly that quality. She nodded. A single small acknowledgement. He stood up. Then he stopped and said, "The weapon assembly with your eyes closed. You've done that since you were a kid, haven't you?" She paused. Then very quietly, almost to herself, "My father taught me." Danny went very still. "He would sit across from me at the kitchen table," she said, and her voice was the same as it always was, steady and controlled, but something very slight and real moved through it on that sentence like a current under still water. He said he wanted to make sure I always knew by touch what was safe and what wasn't. He said in the field, you don't always have light and you don't always have time, and you need to be able to trust your hands when your eyes can't help you. She looked at the page she wasn't reading. He was right. He was always right about things like that. Danny didn't say anything. He understood in the way that young people sometimes understand things that are too large for the usual responses, that there was nothing to add to that. So he just let it be. He walked out. He went back to his quarters. And he thought about the man she was describing. A father who sat across a kitchen table and taught his daughter to trust her hands in the dark. A man who had applied that same precision and integrity to his entire career and had been destroyed for it by a report that the system accepted without enough scrutiny. And he thought about the fact that his daughter had spent 7 years building the case that should have been built 22 years ago, and had walked into this unit alone and accepted the punishment she was given with 2 words, "Yes, Sergeant," because the armory was where she needed to be. He thought about that for a long time. 2 days later, at 14:23 hours, Danny Brooks received a coordination request through an internal communication channel from an administrative adjunct assigned to the operational planning office. The request was phrased as a routine confirmation of unit readiness parameters for the November assignment. It asked for a general description of team composition and primary asset availability. It was phrased so smoothly and so normally that if Danny had not been specifically told to watch for it, he would have answered it without thinking twice. Instead, he wrote back that he was confirming details and would follow up. He logged the request, time source exact phrasing, every word. Then he walked down the corridor to where Madison was reviewing a supply manifest and put the log in front of her. She read it without changing her expression. Then she said very quietly, "Good." "That's not a standard coordination request, is it?" Danny said. "No," she said. "The administrative adjunct who sent it is not the source," she said, "but is a conduit." She folded the log and put it inside the maintenance record she had been reading, which was itself inside a series of other documents, and which would look to anyone who checked like a mundane administrative insert. The question is not who sent it. The question is who asked them to send it, and whether that person is inside this building. Danny felt the cold clarity of that land in his chest. "Are you close?" he asked. She looked at the supply manifest. "Yes," she said. He waited for her to say something else. She didn't. He nodded and walked away. He went back to his regular duties. He performed every task assigned to him with the same reliability and precision he brought to everything. He held the door for the personnel staff. He filed his reports on time. He did all the things he had always done. But his awareness of the unit around him had shifted in a way that could not be reversed. He was looking at it differently now, not with suspicion exactly, with the particular quality of attention that Madison Carter had described to him in the corridor, the ability to find the place where the rhythm was slightly off, and he was beginning to hear it. That same evening, Commander Whitmore received a secure communication from a source he had spent 3 days independently verifying. The communication confirmed 2 of the 3 structural anomalies in the November intelligence package that Hayes had identified. It also added a 4th one that neither Hayes nor Madison had flagged, a discrepancy in the personnel authorization chain at a level so senior that its implications made Whitmore sit very still in his office chair for almost 4 minutes without moving. He read it twice. He locked the communication in his personal safe. He sat back. He had spent 30 years giving this system the benefit of the doubt. He had trusted its processes and accepted its outputs and believed fundamentally that while individuals could fail, the architecture was sound. He no longer believed that. I was sitting in front of evidence that someone with significant access and significant authority had been operating inside that architecture for at least 22 years, building false narratives with the careful, patient skill of someone who understood exactly how much trust the system extended to its own documents. And they had used that skill to destroy Daniel Carter. And they were preparing to use it again on his team. He stood up. He was not a man who sat still once a decision was made. And the decision was made, he would not move openly yet. Madison was right about that. The window for catching this in the mechanism required that the mechanism continue to operate without knowing it had been seen. But Whitmore now understood the full shape of what he was looking at, and understanding the shape meant he could begin building the architecture of the response. He would not let this unit become the next chapter in someone else's false report. He went to the window. The base was quiet, the same courtyard where his team had stood 2 days ago, and laughed at a young woman who walked in alone and asked for nothing. He thought about what Hayes had said. She's not here on a theory. She's been working this for 7 years. We're the last piece. I thought about Madison Carter sitting on the floor of a records corridor, reading maintenance logs that nobody had touched in months, looking for the place where the rhythm was slightly off, with her father's patience and her father's precision, and 7 years of grief sharpened into a tool sharp enough to cut through 22 years of carefully constructed silence. He thought about Ryan Mitchell, who had thrown a rifle at her feet and had no idea he was doing it to Daniel Carter's daughter. I thought about Danny Brooks, 24 years old, sitting on the floor across from her and saying okay with the simple directness of someone who understood without being told that the moment required it. He thought about William Hayes, who had spent 20 years carrying a copy of an archived mission document because he had never quite believed the report was clean and had never known what to do with that feeling. I thought about all of it, all of them, this unit, these people, the history that connected them to a night 22 years ago, and the false story that had been told about that night, and the daughter who had spent her entire adult life building the true one. He pressed his hand flat against the cold glass of the window. Nobody in this unit, not one person, had any idea what was really standing in their building. Not yet, but they were about to find out. And when they did, nothing in this unit would ever be the same. Ryan Mitchell couldn't let it go. That was his problem, and he knew it, and knowing it didn't help at all. He had spent 2 days since his conversation with Madison in the vehicle bay, doing his job with the same mechanical efficiency that had gotten him through deployments, surgeries, and everything else the military had put him through over 15 years. He showed up. He executed. He kept his face neutral in briefings, in his voice level in conversations, and he did not let anyone see that he was turning something over and over inside his head like a stone he couldn't set down. But he couldn't set it down because the woman who had said, "I'm the person who's going to make sure your team comes home," was not someone you forgot. She wasn't someone you filed away under interesting encounter and moved on. She had a quality that very few people Mitchell had met in his entire career possessed, which was the quality of saying something completely true without needing the other person to believe it. She had made a statement of fact and let it stand alone, without defense, without elaboration, without any of the usual scaffolding that people put around important things to make them sound more credible. And it was exactly the absence of scaffolding that made him believe it completely. So on the morning of day 3 at 0740, Mitchell went to find her. She was in the records room, which he knew because Danny Brooks had mentioned it, with the carefully neutral tone that younger operators used when they were carrying information they didn't think was their place to deliver. Mitchell didn't ask Danny anything further. He just nodded and walked down the corridor. He pushed the records room door open without knocking. Madison was at the center table, 3 open folders in front of her and 2 more stacked on her right. She was cross-referencing something between them, moving her finger down one column and then shifting to a page in another folder with the patient rhythm of someone who had been doing this for hours. She looked up when the door opened. Her expression didn't change. "Mitchell," she said. "I need to see it," he said. She held his gaze. "See what?" "Whatever's on your arm." The room went very quiet. He hadn't planned to say it that way. He had gone over several versions of this conversation in his head over the past 2 days, and none of them had started with that sentence. But it was what came out because it was the thing that had been sitting in the back of his mind since the first morning she arrived, since the moment he had thrown that rifle at her feet and watched her answer without flinching. And something about her stillness had pulled at a recognition he couldn't place until later that day when he was cleaning his own weapon and thinking about nothing in particular, and the recognition arrived all at once like a cold hand on the back of his neck. The mark on her left forearm. He had caught a glimpse of it when she bent down to pick up the rifle. He had written it off as a tattoo, the kind of personal symbol that operators sometimes carried that meant something only to them. But then it had nagged at him, the shape of it, the placement, the specific way it sat on the skin, like something that had been earned through a process rather than chosen from a catalog. He had spent the better part of that night trying to place it. And early this morning, somewhere around 0400, he had placed it. Madison looked at him for a long 3 seconds. Then she set her pen down and pulled up the left sleeve of her utility top to the elbow and held her arm out across the table and her wrist upward. Mitchell walked to the table and leaned forward. The symbol was small and precise, faded at the edges in the way that marks fade when they've been carried for years through sun and salt water and physical conditions that would degrade most things. But the core of it was clear and the shape was unmistakable once you knew what you were looking at. And Mitchell knew exactly what he was looking at. He straightened up slowly. He took one breath. Then he pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. And he did it in a specific way. Not the way you sit down with a subordinate or a stranger or someone you're still evaluating. The way you sit down with someone who has earned a place at the table that you respect. That's a DevGru selection mark, he said. His voice was careful, almost quiet. Maritime Special Operations Tier, the Black Program variant. He paused. That selection hasn't been publicly run in 7 years. The last confirmed class had 6 candidates, 2 completed. That's correct, she said. He stared at her. You're one of the 2. Yes. He put both hands flat on the table in front of him and looked at them. The motion of a man recalibrating, working through the math of what he had just confirmed and finding that the math produced a number he had not been prepared for. 2 completed that selection in the entire documented history of the program, he said. 3, she corrected quietly. The first completion was unofficial, not logged in the accessible record. But it happened. He looked up. Your father. The word landed in the room and sat there. Madison lowered her sleeve. My father completed the original black variant 16 years before I did, she said. His completion was expunged from the record as part of the same process that expunged his name from the mission to Brive. They took everything, the selection achievement, the service record notation, the commendation that preceded the mission. She was completely still. They were very thorough, which is why it took me 7 years to reconstruct it. Mitchell didn't say anything. The mark, she continued, was the one thing they couldn't take. He carried it on his arm his entire life. After he died, I went through the same selection. Not to honor him. She met Mitchell's eyes directly, to earn the right to carry the evidence. The silence in that room was the kind that has weight. Mitchell had been in some variation of this world for 15 years. He had served alongside men who had done extraordinary things that were never acknowledged publicly, whose names would never appear in any record available to the people who benefited from what they did. He understood that the classified world operated on sacrifice and silence and a trust that had no paper backing it. He had accepted that as the nature of the work. But what Madison was describing was something different. Not the necessary silence of classified operations. The deliberate erasure of a man who had done the work correctly and been destroyed for it by people who needed a name to put on a failure they had engineered. He said, "Who knows you're here, the full picture?" Whitmore, she said. Hayes. And me as of right now. And you. He looked at the folders on the table. What's in those? The last segment of the verification chain, she said. I have the structural anomalies in the November package. I have the source architecture matched to the original mission documents. I have the coordination request that came through the administrative channel 2 days ago. She touched the edge of the top folder. What I need is the personnel authorization pathway at the senior level, the signature chain that shows who approved the November intelligence package at the tier above the operational planning office. That's restricted access, Mitchell said immediately. I know. Authorization at that level requires a 2-person sign-off from the senior command structure. I know, she said again. He looked at her, she looked at him. And Mitchell understood what she was not quite saying because she was being careful about what she asked directly. And he respected that carefulness, and he understood that what she was offering him was the choice to involve himself fully or to walk out of this room and know nothing further and be protected by that ignorance. He stayed in his chair. What exactly do you need, he said. She opened the top folder and turned it to face him. She pointed to a specific line in the document. This authorization code. It routes to the signing authority at Naval Special Warfare Command level. The code itself is in the personnel authorization log, which is maintained in the senior administrative office. She paused. The log is reviewed quarterly. The last review was 6 weeks ago. The next one isn't scheduled for 8 weeks. Meaning nobody's looking at it right now, Mitchell said. Meaning the window for accessing it without triggering an audit flag is right now, she said. He leaned forward and looked at the document. His eyes moved quickly across it with the practiced speed of someone who spent a career reading operational documents. Then he sat back. If I pull that log and the request is flagged, he said carefully, it ends the operation. Whoever's on the other end knows we're looking. Yes, she said, and if the request isn't flagged, then we have the authorization signature, and the signature confirms who approved the intelligence package. She looked at him steadily, and we have everything we need to verify the pattern completely. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, give me 2 hours. He stood up. He pushed the chair back in with the same deliberateness with which he had sat down. He looked at her one more time, and she looked at him, and neither of them said anything further because nothing further needed to be said. He walked out. Madison watched the door close. Then she turned back to her folders and kept working because there was still work to do, and the work didn't wait for the emotional register of the moment to settle. That was something her father had taught her too, though not at the kitchen table. He had taught it by example by the way he kept moving through difficult things without stopping to catalog how difficult they were. She kept working. 1 hour and 47 minutes later, Mitchell came back. He came through the records room door with the same controlled stride he always had, but Madison saw it immediately. The slight compression at the corners of his eyes. The way he held the folder he was carrying close to his body, not loose in one hand, the way he would carry something routine. He sat down across from her without preamble. He opened the folder and put it on the table between them. Authorization code traces to a senior command signature, he said. Rear Admiral Carl Tessner, Naval Special Warfare Command. He signed the intelligence package certification for the November operation 11 days ago. Madison was very still. You know that name, Mitchell said. It was not a question. Yes, she said very quietly. Tell me. She put her hand on the edge of the folder. Rear Admiral Carl Tessner was the intelligence liaison officer for the mission 22 years ago. He was a lieutenant commander at the time. He was responsible for preparing and certifying the intelligence package that was provided to the ground team. She looked up from the folder. He was the person who signed off on the package that turned out to be wrong in the most critical possible way. The understanding moved across Mitchell's face slowly. The way certain realizations move not fast like a shock, but slow and cold, like something rising from a depth. He certified the false package 22 years ago, Mitchell said. And he certified the anomalous package 11 days ago, Madison said. He's been in the system the whole time. He's been rising through it, she said. Lieutenant Commander to Rear Admiral in 22 years. Each promotion certified by a record that looks exactly the way it's supposed to look because he knows how to build records that look exactly the way they're supposed to look. Mitchell stood up from the chair. He walked to the far wall and stood with his back to her for a moment, and Madison let him have that moment because she understood what it cost a person to absorb the information that the system they had given their life to had been carrying a predator inside it for over 2 decades. Then he turned around. He set up your father, he said. My father identified the anomaly in the original package before the mission launched, she said. He flagged it through the chain of command. He put it in writing. The flag went to Tessner's office. 3 days later, the mission went forward with the original package unchanged. She kept her voice level. My father's written flag disappeared from the record before the post-mission review. Mitchell put both hands on the back of the chair he had been sitting in and gripped it hard enough that his knuckles whitened. He flagged it, Mitchell said. The words came out rough. He tried to stop it. He did everything right, Madison said. Everything, by the book, through the proper channels. And it didn't matter because the person those channels led to was the person running the deception. The room was completely silent. And now he's coming after this unit, Mitchell said. The November operation has the same structural signature, she said. The same deliberately wrong critical intelligence point. The same gap in the verification chain. When the operation is compromised, the post-mission review will be prepared in advance the same way the last one was. And there will be a name already written into it. Mitchell looked at her hard. Whose name? Madison met his eyes. Whitmore's, she said. The word hit the room like something physical. Mitchell let go of the chair back. He straightened up. His face went through a rapid internal reorganization that he didn't fully suppress, and Madison watched it happen and said nothing. Because that was the right thing to do, and she knew it. He's targeting the commander, Mitchell said. Tessner has been in the system long enough to know exactly whose removal would create the maximum disruption to this unit's capability and the minimum scrutiny of the removal itself, she said. Whitmore has a long decorated record. He's also been in one position long enough that a mission failure could be credibly attributed to operational rigidity or degraded judgment without raising the kind of alarms that a younger officer's removal might trigger. She paused. He's a perfect target, the same way my father was a perfect target. Mitchell was very quiet. Then he said something that Madison had not expected. He said, I vouch for the November intelligence package. She looked at him. Last week, he said, his voice had a specific quality, flat and exposed at the same time the way voices sound when someone is being fully honest about something that cost them something. Tessner's office sent a liaison to the unit, standard pre-operational coordination. I was the senior operator present for the meeting. The liaison presented the package overview and asked if our team confirmed readiness to proceed based on the intelligence profile. He stopped. I said yes. I put my name on the confirmation. Madison held his gaze without looking away. You didn't know, she said. That's not the point, he said sharply, not at her, at himself. Ryan, she said, and it was the first time she had used his first name. It stopped him. You confirmed a package that looked exactly like every legitimate package you've ever seen prepared by a source with 22 years of unremarkable access to the certification process with no visible anomaly at the level of the document you were shown. She didn't soften it or dramatize it. She said it cleanly. You could not have caught it from where you were standing. My father couldn't catch it from where he was standing, and he was looking directly at it. That's the point of the mechanism. It's built to be invisible at the operational level. He looked at the folder on the table. What do we do, he said. And the shift in that question, from what are you going to do to what do we do, was not a small thing. Madison registered it without showing it on her face, but she registered it completely. We give Tessner exactly what he expects to see, she said. Nothing changes visibly. The unit continues normal pre-operational activity. The November timeline continues on schedule. She looked at him steadily, and we build the exposure package in parallel, full documentation of the anomaly chain, the personnel authorization signature, the match to the original mission documents, my father's flagging record, which I've reconstructed from secondary sources, and the coordination request that came through the administrative conduit 3 days ago. The conduit, Mitchell said. You know who the internal source is. She was quiet for just a moment. Then I have a strong hypothesis. Tell me. Not yet, she said, because the moment I name someone based on a hypothesis rather than evidence, this unit fractures in exactly the way Tessner's mechanism is designed to produce. Internal suspicion, breakdown of operational cohesion, loss of focus before a major operation. She shook her head slightly. I need 48 more hours. To confirm the source. To make it irrefutable, she said. There's a difference. A hypothesis gets us suspended and investigated. Irrefutable evidence gets Tessner court-martialed. Mitchell stared at her. He said, your father built a career on irrefutable evidence, on the kind of documentation and precision that should have been impossible to dismiss, and they dismissed it anyway. I know, she said. What makes you sure this time is different? It was the right question. It was the most important question anyone had asked her in 7 years of working toward this moment. And she sat with it for a full 3 seconds before she answered, because it deserved that. Because this time, she said, the evidence doesn't go through Tessner's office. She looked at Mitchell with an absolute clarity that had nothing theatrical in it, nothing performative, just the flat certainty of someone who has been walking toward a specific point for a very long time and can see it clearly now. This time it goes around him, and he doesn't know that channel exists. Master Chief Hayes found Commander Whitmore in the physical training area at OH-600 the next morning. Whitmore was on the pull-up bar running through reps with the controlled mechanical pace of someone using physical work to process something their mind needed to run through several more times. Hayes waited until he dropped down. Mitchell came to me last night, Hayes said. Whitmore reached for his towel. What did he say? Everything, Hayes said. He told me about the authorization code, the Tessner signature, the connection to the original mission. He paused. He also told me he put his name on the confirmation for the November package. Whitmore pressed the towel against his face for a moment, then dropped it. How did he handle that? The way Mitchell handles everything, Hayes said. He accepted it and moved directly to what needed to happen next. No self-pity, no defensiveness. He paused. He's solid, Ethan. He's been solid since the moment he understood what was actually happening. He hasn't been solid to her, Whitmore said. He's correcting that, Hayes said. He told her himself, sat in that records room and told her he signed the confirmation. Whitmore was quiet. She told him he couldn't have caught it from where he was standing, Hayes said. He said that's not the point. She said Ryan and used his first name and told him it was the point. He paused. He believed her because she wasn't trying to make him feel better. She was being accurate. She's very much her father's daughter, Whitmore said. In the best possible way, Hayes said. They stood in the quiet of the training area for a moment. Then Whitmore said, Tessner. Yes, Hayes said. The word had a weight to it. I served alongside him in the late 90s, Whitmore said. 2 years of operational overlap. He was meticulous, detailed. He knew intelligence architecture better than anyone I'd seen. I thought it was competence. He looked at the pull-up bar. It was practice. He's been practicing for 22 years, Hayes said, and he chose my unit for the next operation. He chose you specifically, Hayes said carefully. Madison confirmed it. You're the intended fall. The weight of that landed differently than information usually landed on Whitmore, because this wasn't operational information. This was personal. Someone he had worked alongside, had eaten with, had referred to in conversations as a solid officer, had spent 22 years building toward using his name, the same way he had used Daniel Carter's name, a prepared space in a false report, a slot already written before the debrief. He reached up and gripped the pull-up bar with both hands and hung there for a moment with his weight on his arms and his eyes on the floor. Then he pulled himself up. 12 reps, controlled, deliberate, each one exactly like the last. Then he dropped down again. She needs 48 hours, he said. That's what Mitchell said. We give her 48 hours. He picked up his towel again. And we make sure everyone in this unit keeps performing exactly as they have been. Nothing changes on the surface. Mitchell won't find that easy, Hayes said. No, Whitmore agreed, but he'll do it anyway. That's who he is. And Brooks has been steady throughout this, Whitmore said. He logged the coordination request without being told why and brought it to her without asking more than she was ready to answer. He's been more valuable in this situation than people with 3 times his experience would have been, because he operates on judgment rather than assumption. He paused. When this is over, I'm making a formal notation in his file. Hayes nodded. The 48 hours started then, and they were the longest 48 hours most of the people in that building had ever spent, because the hardest thing in the world for people trained to respond to threats is to respond to nothing while knowing the threat is real and close and watching. Mitchell spent those hours in a state of controlled internal tension that he masked with perfect external precision. He ran every drill at full commitment. He engaged in every briefing with full attention. He responded to the administrative liaison's follow-up inquiry about unit composition with a response that was warm and complete and revealed nothing outside of standard operational parameters. And he did it without hesitating, because hesitation would have been the signal. Danny Brooks moved through those 48 hours with the particular quality of focus that comes to young people when they have been trusted with something real for the first time. He didn't perform normalcy. He lived it because Madison had told him that performance is visible and normalcy isn't, and the difference is whether you're thinking about how you look while you're doing it. He stopped thinking about how he looked. He just did his job. And somewhere inside the discipline of doing his job, he paid attention to the rhythm of the unit around him in the way she had described, looking for the place where it was slightly off. He found it on the morning of the second day. It was a small thing, a pattern in the timing of internal communications from a specific terminal in the operational planning office. He had been watching the administrative network activity in the background of his regular duties, not because anyone told him to watch it, but because he was the kind of person who noticed what was running in the background of things. The pattern was barely visible, a recurring send time that correlated with periods of low building activity. Specifically, the 40-minute window between the end of morning briefing and the beginning of the first operational rotation, when most of the unit was in transit between buildings. He documented it. He brought it to Madison on the afternoon of day 2. She looked at it for 10 seconds. Then she said, "Who has access to that terminal?" Danny told her. 3 names. 2 of them had verifiable alibis for 2 of the 3 send time windows based on mission rotation logs Danny had checked before coming to find her. The 3rd name had no alibi. Madison looked at the 3rd name for a long time. Then she looked up at Danny. "Does Whitmore know this person well?" she asked. Danny thought about it. "Yes, 4 years of service, overlap, personal trust relationship." She nodded slowly. The kind of nod that isn't agreement with what someone said, but acknowledgement of something you were already braced for. "Okay," she said. "Who do I tell?" Danny asked. "No one yet," she said. "Bring this to me, that's all." She looked at the document again. "The evidence has to be assembled completely before the name is spoken in this building. Once we say it, we can't unsay it. And if we say it before the chain is complete, we give Tessner exactly the disruption he needs." "How much more do you need?" Danny asked. She stood up. She took the document he had given her and placed it carefully inside the consolidated file she had been building over the course of 9 days in this unit. The file that contained the maintenance records, anomalies, the coordination request log, the personnel authorization signature, the structural match documentation between the November package and the original mission archive. She picked up the file. It was thick and heavy in her hands. She held it and looked at it for a moment in a way that Danny would remember for a long time afterward. Not with triumph, not with relief, with a specific quiet weight. The weight of something that has been carried for a very long time and is almost ready to be set down, but not quite yet, because setting it down is not a small thing, and she was not going to do it carelessly. Then she looked at Danny and said the words that completed the 48-hour window. "I have enough." That night, Mitchell was doing a final equipment check alone in the gear room when the door opened and Madison walked in. She was carrying the consolidated file against her chest. She walked to where he was standing and set it on the bench beside his gear without speaking. He looked at it, then at her. "Is it done?" he said. "It's complete," she said. "Every link in the chain, the anomaly documentation, the authorization signature, the internal sourced communication pattern, the historical match." She put her hand on the file. "And my father's original flagging report, the one that disappeared from the record 22 years ago." He stared at her. "You have the original." "A reconstructed version," she said, "built from secondary references. 3 separate document archives that each preserved a partial reference to it without preserving the document itself. Cross-referenced and authenticated by 2 independent forensic document analysts working without knowledge of each other or the overall case." She paused. "It's not the original, but it's irrefutable." He picked up the file and held it in his hands. "There's a name in there," she said, "toward the back, the internal source." He looked at the file. He didn't open it. "Tell me," he said. She told him. He was silent for a full 30 seconds. His hands held the file without moving. His face went through something she had seen before, that same process of absorption and recalibration, the cost of a specific kind of being wrong that lands harder than ordinary wrongness. Then he said, "He's been here for 3 years. "Yes," she said. "He knew my team," he said, not as a complaint, as a fact that he was making himself hold without flinching. "Yes," she said. "He trusted us while he was feeding our positions to Tessner." "Yes." Mitchell put the file down carefully. He looked at it for a moment. Then he picked up the piece of gear he had been checking when she walked in and turned it over in his hands, with the methodical attention of a man using a physical task to anchor himself while his mind did the harder work. "When do we move?" he said. "Tomorrow morning," she said. "Whitmore will make the contact directly. The channel bypasses Tessner's office entirely." "And our source," he said. The word had a particular flatness to it that was more precise than anger. "Will be addressed," she said, "carefully, with the same documentation standard as everything else." He nodded once. He kept working on the gear. She turned to leave. "Lieutenant," he said. She stopped. "Your father," he said. He didn't look up from the gear in his hands. "He was right about the package, about the flag, about all of it." He paused. "I know that doesn't change anything." She stood in the doorway. "It changes something," she said quietly. "It just changes something different than most people think it does." He looked up then, but she was already gone. And he stood in the gear room alone with the file on the bench beside him, with the name he hadn't wanted to learn in the back of it, with the weight of what was coming in the morning sitting on his chest like something real and heavy and necessary. He finished checking the gear. All of it. Every buckle, every strap, every load-bearing component. Because that was what you did when the work needed to be done and nobody was watching. You did it anyway. You did it completely. And you trusted that the person who built the standard was right about why it mattered. Even if that person had been carrying the proof of it alone for 7 years in a file on her arm and in everything her father had ever quietly shown her about what it meant to do the right thing inside a system that wasn't always ready to recognize it. Commander Whitmore made the call at 0500, not from his office, not from any terminal inside the building. He drove off base in his personal vehicle parked 2 miles away in a lot behind a grocery store that didn't open until 7, and used a secure line that had exactly one contact programmed into it. A line he had carried for 4 years without ever using it because the person on the other end had told him when they gave it to him that it was for the kind of situation you hope never came, and that if it ever did come, he would know. This was that situation. The phone rang twice, a voice answered, male, controlled. The voice of someone who was already awake because people at that level didn't sleep the way other people slept. Whitmore said 7 words. I have the file. Tessner, 22 years. The silence on the other end lasted 4 seconds. Then the voice said, where are you? Off base. Secure. Stay off base. I'm sending someone to you in 40 minutes. Do not return to the building until you hear from me. The line went dead. Whitmore sat in his car in the empty parking lot and watched the sky begin to change color on the eastern edge and thought about Daniel Carter. He thought about a man he had known and respected and failed not through malice, but through the specific failure of trusting a system more than his own instinct, when his instinct had been telling him quietly for 22 years that something about that report wasn't right. He had called it grief. He had called it survivor's guilt. He had filed the feeling under things that happen after men die and you're still there, and he had moved forward because moving forward was what you did. He was done filing it. The contact arrived in 38 minutes. A woman in civilian clothes driving a gray sedan. She took the file. She read the summary documentation in the car, in the parking lot without speaking for 11 minutes. Then she looked up. The internal source, she said. You've confirmed the identity. Confirmed and documented, Whitmore said. Communication pattern, terminal access logs, correlation to the coordination request timeline, and the Tessner authorization signature. On the November package certification, matching the source architecture of the original mission package from 22 years ago. She looked at the file again. This reconstruction of the original flagging report, independently authenticated by 2 forensic analysts who worked without shared information. She closed the file. She looked at Whitmore with the kind of directness that people in her position developed and never lost. Commander, I need you to understand what happens when this moves forward. Tessner has 22 years of accumulated relationships inside this command structure. The removal process will be contested. The people he's built relationships with will not all be complicit, but some of them will resist the disruption simply because institutional disruption is uncomfortable. And the alternative requires accepting that the institution harbored something this serious for this long. I understand, Whitmore said. The unit's operational timeline will be suspended. I understand. And the internal source will require immediate secure custody, which means your team loses a member without explanation during the suspension period. I understand that too, Whitmore said. He held her gaze. I've understood all of that since I read the file last night. It doesn't change what needs to happen. She studied him for a moment. Then she said, the lieutenant. Sir. Madison Carter. She said the name with a specific quality that made Whitmore look at her more carefully. She built this. She built all of it, he confirmed. 7 years, the contact said quietly. Not to him, almost to herself. Then she said her father's flag report, the one that disappeared from the record. Reconstructed and authenticated. The contact was quiet for a moment. Then she put the file on her lap and looked at the changing sky through the windshield. She had a quality in that moment that Whitmore recognized, the quality of someone absorbing information that confirms something they have been carrying for a long time. He said, did you know him, Daniel Carter? She didn't answer immediately. Then, I was a junior intelligence analyst when the original mission review was conducted. I wrote a section of the assessment that was later overwritten. She paused. I didn't know until years later that it had been changed. By the time I found out, the case was closed and Carter was gone, and I didn't have enough standing to reopen it alone. The parking lot was completely quiet. The report that destroyed him, Whitmore said slowly. You saw it happen. I saw the edges of it, she said. Enough to know something was wrong. Not enough at the time to prove it. She looked at the file in her lap. She proved it. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then she picked up her phone. Back inside the building, the morning was running on its ordinary rhythm. Briefings, rotation schedules, equipment checks. The routine surface of a unit preparing for an operation that, as far as most of its members knew, was still fully on track. Mitchell was in the briefing room when Whitmore's absence was noted. The duty officer mentioned it neutrally. Commander Whitmore had an early off-site meeting, expected back by 0900, standard enough that it didn't produce questions. Mitchell didn't react. He went through the morning briefing with his usual sharp attention, tracking every detail of the operational preparation discussion, asking the questions he always asked, making the notations he always made. The only difference invisible to everyone in the room was that he was simultaneously running a second track of awareness across every person in that room, looking at them the way Madison had described looking at maintenance records. Looking for the place where the rhythm was slightly off. He had a name in his head now. That made it harder, not easier, because knowing the name meant that every ordinary interaction carried an extra layer of scrutiny. And scrutiny was something that experienced operators could sense, and sensing scrutiny would alert the source before the mechanism was complete. So Mitchell did what he had trained to do in the most demanding environments on Earth, which was to maintain two entirely separate behavioral registers simultaneously, to be exactly himself on the surface while something else entirely ran underneath. Hunt had done it in the field under live fire. He could do it here. The name was Senior Petty Officer Jason Krebs. 3 years in the unit, competent, reliable. The kind of solid middle-tier performer that every unit depended on for continuity. Not flashy enough to attract intense attention. Not problematic enough to generate scrutiny. Exactly the kind of person that a patient experience operator like Tessner would identify and cultivate, because the most useful source inside a classified unit was never the most visible member. Krebs had access to the operational planning terminal during the windows Danny identified. He had no alibi for 2 of the 3 send time correlations, and his assignment history when Madison ran it through the pattern she had built over 7 years showed a 2-week overlap with a training program at a facility that on its surface looked like a standard advanced communications course, but which Madison had connected through 4 intermediate documentation steps to a program that Tessner had run through a contracted training organization 9 years ago. The connection wasn't proof by itself. It was a thread. But in the context of everything else, it was the thread that completed the pattern. Krebs didn't know the file was complete. He didn't know that the channel he had been feeding information through had been identified. He came into the morning briefing with the same composed, unremarkable presence he always had, and he sat in his usual seat and he performed his usual function, and he had no idea that the 48-hour countdown he had inadvertently triggered by sending that coordination request through the administrative conduit had already expired. Danny Brooks sat 3 seats away from Krebs during the briefing and felt something he had not expected to feel, which was not anger, not even a particular coldness, but a specific quality of sadness. The kind that comes when you find out that someone you worked beside and trusted and probably would have run toward a threat with if the situation called for it was the opposite of what they appeared to be. He hadn't expected sadness. He had expected something cleaner, something with a sharper edge. But he sat 3 seats from Krebs and felt sad, and he did his job, and he didn't look at Krebs any differently than he looked at anyone else in the room. And when the briefing ended, he filed out with everyone else and went to his next assignment. Madison was in the records room. She had been there since 0430. She had finished the file the night before, and she had slept 3 hours and come back, not because there was more to add to the file, but because the file was done and the next phase was not in her hands, and she needed somewhere to be where the waiting felt purposeful. So she was reading through the oldest maintenance records in the archive, the ones that went back 12 years, looking at the long baseline of how this unit had maintained its systems before any of the current personnel were assigned. It was not a useful activity in terms of the immediate situation, but it gave her hands something to do while her mind ran through every possible response to every possible development in the next 12 hours. And her hands needed something to do. The door opened at 0840. It was Hayes. He closed the door behind him and stood in the middle of the room with the particular controlled energy of a man carrying the news that has not yet settled into a stable form. Whitmore made the contact, he said. She looked up from the records. The contact received the file, Hayes said. She's moving. Madison processed this for a moment. Timeline. Tessner's authorization to move forward on the November package is being frozen at the command level as of 0600. He doesn't know yet. The freeze is being applied through a standard administrative hold on the certification pathway that will look from his position like a routine processing delay. He'll accept that for how long? Madison asked. 48 hours before he starts pushing back through his channels, Hayes said. By which point the formal review process will be open and his access will be restricted. And Krebs. Hayes was quiet for a moment. That happens today. Whitmore is being brought back to the base now to conduct it personally. Madison looked at the records in her lap. She set them down. He's going to have to do it in front of the unit, she said. It wasn't a question. Not the full unit, Hayes said carefully, but the senior members will be present. It needs witnesses for the documentation and for the unit's cohesion after the fact. Mitchell, myself, and two others who have been read into the situation at the command level. She nodded slowly. Hayes crossed the room and sat down across from her in the chair that Mitchell had occupied 3 days before. He sat the same way Mitchell had sat, with a specific deliberateness that acknowledged the weight of the moment. He put his hands on the table. How are you doing? He asked. The question surprised her, not because it was inappropriate, but because it was the first time anyone in this building had asked it. Since she arrived, every conversation had been operational. Every interaction had been purposeful. Nobody had stopped to ask Madison Carter how she was doing with any of it. She looked at Hayes. I'm okay, she said. Then she thought about it more honestly and said, I'm ready for it to be done. 7 years is a long time to carry something, he said. He carried it his whole life, she said. 7 years was the least I could do. Hayes held her gaze. He would be proud of you, and he said, not as a comfort, as a statement of fact delivered by a man who had known Daniel Carter and was in a position to make that assessment accurately. She absorbed it without responding immediately. Then she said, he would tell me the work isn't done until the documentation is filed correctly. Hayes almost smiled. It was a small thing contained and real. That sounds exactly like him. He had a saying, she said. He used it when I was impatient about something, when I wanted to move faster than the evidence supported. He looked at the records in front of her. He said the truth doesn't have a deadline, but sloppiness does. Do the work right and the truth takes care of itself. The room was quiet. Do the work right, Hayes repeated softly. Every time, she said. No shortcuts, no assumptions, no letting urgency substitute for accuracy. She paused. That's why he flagged the package through official channels, even when he suspected those channels led to the problem. Because circumventing the process, even a compromised process, would have given Tessner grounds to dismiss the flag as irregular. She looked at Hayes. He did everything right. Even knowing it probably wouldn't be enough. And you did the same thing, Hayes said. 7 years. Every step documented. Every link authenticated. No shortcuts. I am his daughter, she said simply. Hayes put both hands flat on the table and stood up. He had the movement of a man who has been sitting with something heavy and is now ready to carry it forward rather than sit with it further. Whitmore arrives back on base at 09:15, he said. He wants you in his office at 09:30, not optional. Understood, she said. And Madison. He stopped at the door. Whatever happens in that office, and after, I want you to know something. He turned to face her. I've been in this business for 31 years. I have seen men and women do extraordinary things under conditions that should have made extraordinary things impossible. What you built, the way you built it, the patience and the precision and the willingness to stay invisible for 9 days in a building full of people who didn't know what they were standing next to. He stopped. Your father did that too, not the investigation, the invisibility, the ability to do the right thing without needing recognition for it. He paused. It's rarer than any certification mark. It's rarer than any selection program, and it is the most important quality I have ever seen in this work. He walked out. Madison sat alone in the records room. She put her hand on the stack of maintenance records in front of her. Old records, long histories of a unit caring for its systems, documenting what worked and what didn't, building the baseline of reliability that kept people alive in the field. Ordinary work done carefully over many years by people whose names didn't appear in headlines. She thought about her father sitting across a kitchen table in the low light of an evening after everyone else had gone to bed with a disassembled weapon between them and his patient voice walking her through each component. Not because she needed to know it for any immediate purpose, because someday she might, and when that day came, she would need her hands to remember what her eyes couldn't see. She had been 17 years old. She hadn't understood yet what he was actually teaching her. She had thought it was a skill, a practical competency, the kind of thing you learned because your father wanted to share something he was good at. It was only later in the years after he was gone that she understood it was a philosophy, a complete way of understanding how to move through a world that doesn't always make things visible in time. You build the knowledge before you need it. You document the truth before someone tries to erase it. You do the work right because sloppiness has a deadline and the truth doesn't. She picked up the records. She stacked them in order. She put them back where they belonged. Whitmore's office at OH 930 was not a large room. With 6 people in it, it was close and warm, and the air had a specific quality that rooms have when the people in them are all carrying something significant and none of them are pretending otherwise. Whitmore was behind his desk. Hayes stood to his left. Madison stood to his right, which was a positioning nobody had explicitly arranged, but which happened naturally and which nobody commented on. Mitchell was across the desk, standing with his arms at his sides in a posture that was not quite attention and not quite at ease, but somewhere in between the posture of a man who is fully present and fully committed and waiting for what comes next. 2 senior officers from the base command structure stood near the door. They had arrived with Whitmore. They had seen the file. They were here as witnesses and as the formal institutional representation that this process required to be legitimate rather than just correct. Krebs was the last to arrive. He had been summoned with a standard message from the duty office. Commander requires your presence. Conference room OH 930. Nothing unusual in the phrasing, nothing that would signal what was waiting. He came through the door and stopped. He read the room in approximately 2 seconds, the way trained operators read rooms, taking in the position and expression of every person present and assembling those data points into a picture of what kind of situation this was. And the picture he assembled in those 2 seconds produced a response in his face that was brief and involuntary, and then gone suppressed with the speed of someone who had been trained to suppress things. But Mitchell saw it, Madison saw it, Hayes saw it. Whitmore said, "Close the door, Petty Officer Krebs." Krebs closed the door. He straightened. His face was back to composed. Whatever he was feeling was fully contained now. He had had his 2 seconds and spent them, and he was done spending them. "Sir," he said. "We're going to have a conversation," Whitmore said. His voice was the same it always was. Level, precise, carrying no excess weight. The voice of a man who had made a decision and was implementing it without drama. And before we start, I want you to understand that the process we're following today is fully documented and fully authorized. Everything said in this room is being recorded. The 2 officers at the door are witnesses. And the documentation this conversation is based on has already been delivered to the appropriate command authority. Krebs said nothing. "Rear Admiral Carl Tessner," Whitmore said. Something happened in Krebs's face. Another brief involuntary response. Gone in under a second. "The coordination request of 3 days ago," Whitmore continued. "The terminal access pattern, the communication pathway." He paused. "We have all of it, documented, authenticated, and delivered." The room was completely silent. Krebs looked at Whitmore. Then his eyes moved. They moved across the room with the systematic scan of a man assessing his options, and when they reached Madison, they stopped. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "How long?" He was asking her. Not Whitmore, not Hayes, her. "How long have you been building the case?" he said. 7 years, she said. Something shifted in his face that was not a simple emotion. It was complicated, the kind of complicated that happens when a person who has been very good at something encounters evidence that someone else has been better at it for longer. You came here specifically, he said. Yes, she said. Tessner doesn't know, he said. It was not quite a question. Not yet, she said. He absorbed that. Then he said something that nobody in the room had expected. He said it quietly and without apparent calculation, in the voice of a man who has stopped performing and is saying the actual thing. I didn't know about Carter, he said. Not at first. When I was first approached, it was framed as legitimate intelligence coordination outside standard channels, a security protocol for sensitive operations. I believed it for almost a year before I understood what I was actually participating in. He paused. By the time I understood, I had provided enough information that pulling back wasn't a clean option. The room was very still. Mitchell said with careful control, "That's not a defense." "I know," Krebs said. "I'm not offering it as one." He looked at Mitchell directly. "I'm saying it because you deserve to know the actual sequence, not because it reduces what I did." He looked at the floor for a moment. "I knew about the November package. I knew it was designed to fail. I knew Whitmore was the intended name in the post-mission review." He looked up. "I didn't know how to stop it without destroying myself, so I kept going." He paused. "That's who I've been for 2 years." The silence in the room was the kind that has several different textures in it simultaneously. The texture of anger that Mitchell was containing with visible effort. The texture of a specific exhausted recognition in Hayes. The texture of something complicated in Whitmore's face that was not quite forgiveness and not quite condemnation, but something that lived between those two things in the space where experience teaches you that people are rarely simply one thing. And Madison, who had built a 7-year case on the principle that the truth deserved to be documented, completely and accurately looked at Jason Krebs and said nothing. Because what he had said was part of the record now, and the record was what mattered. And adding to it emotionally would not serve the documentation or the people the documentation was built to protect. Whitmore said, "You'll be placed in secure custody pending the formal review process. The 2 officers at the door will accompany you. You will have full access to representation." He paused. "The cooperation you've shown in this conversation will be part of the official record." Krebs nodded once. He walked toward the door, then he stopped. He turned back toward the room, toward no one specifically. "The November operation," he said, "the objective is real. The intelligence was real until Tessner's office modified the package. The original source data before the modification is in the certification archive at the 3rd tier. I know where it is. I'll give you the access pathway." He paused. "If there's a way to run the operation clean, that's how." Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Whitmore said, "Write it down." One of the officers near the door produced a notepad. Krebs wrote for 45 seconds. He handed the notepad back. He walked out with the 2 officers. The door closed. The 5 remaining people in the room held the weight of the last 20 minutes. Mitchell exhaled. It was a controlled exhale, deliberate, the kind that people use to discharge something before it builds past the point of management. He looked at the floor, then at Whitmore. "He handed us the clean pathway," he said. "Yes," Whitmore said. "That doesn't fix what he did," Mitchell said. "No," Whitmore agreed, "but it's what it is." He looked at the notepad. "And if it lets us run the November operation against the original intelligence without Tessner's modification, then the people who would have been put in danger by the false package come home safe." He paused. "Which is the outcome that matters." Mitchell looked at Madison. She was looking at the door Krebs had walked through. Her expression was the one she usually had, controlled and deliberate. But something underneath it was different. The specific quality of someone who is standing at the end of a very long road and feeling the end of it, not with joy exactly, not with relief, but with the particular kind of quiet that descends when something enormous is finally finished. "Tessner," she said without turning around. "The command contact is moving on him as we speak," Whitmore said. "The administrative hold on the November certification is the first containment step. The formal authorization for the investigation was issued at 08700. He'll know today," she said. "By noon," Whitmore confirmed. "At the latest." She turned around. She looked at Whitmore with that direct, settled gaze. "And my father's record." Whitmore held her gaze for a long moment. He picked up the file on his desk. The consolidated file that she had built over 9 days in this building and 7 years before it. He held it in both hands the way you hold something that represents more than its physical weight. The reconstruction of his flagging report, Whitmore said, is being submitted as part of the formal review documentation. The review will include a full reassessment of the original mission record. He paused. It will take time. These processes don't move quickly. I know, she said, but it will move, he said. And the outcome of a proper review, given what's in this file, is not genuinely in doubt. She absorbed that in silence. Then she said, he just wanted it on the record. That was all he ever wanted. Not recognition, not restoration, just for the record to say what actually happened. Whitmore set the file down. He looked at her across the desk in a way that carried the full weight of 30 years, and a specific debt that he had been carrying without knowing exactly what to do with it. It will, he said. I promise you that. The word promise in Commander Ethan Whitmore's vocabulary was not a casual word. The people in that room knew that. It carried the weight of every commitment he had ever made and kept. And the fact that he said it without hesitation, looking directly at the daughter of the man he had failed to protect, 22 years ago, had a quality that was different from anything else that had happened in that office. Hayes looked at the window. Mitchell looked at his hands. And Madison Carter stood in the middle of Commander Whitmore's office and felt for the first time in 7 years the specific and unfamiliar sensation of something being over. Not finished. Some things were still in process, would be in process for months. Tessner's formal review, the reassessment of the original record, the November operation, which would now be rebuilt around Krebs's access pathway to the clean intelligence source, and which would require complete reorientation in the next 10 days. There was still work to do. There would always be work to do. But the thing that had held her like a current for 7 years, the force that had directed every decision and shaped every skill she had developed and defined the purpose underneath every day of her adult life, had shifted. It had not disappeared, but its character had changed. It was no longer the thing driving her. It was the thing behind her. It was the foundation, and now she could stand on the foundation and look forward. She took one breath. She said, "When do we start rebuilding the November package around the clean source data?" Whitmore looked at her for a moment. Then, for the first time since she had arrived at this unit, he almost smiled. It was contained and real, the same quality Hayes had shown earlier. The smile of someone who recognizes without sentimentality exactly what kind of person they are dealing with. "Oh, 1100, he said. "Briefing room, full planning team." "I'll be there," she said. She walked to the door. "Lieutenant Carter," Whitmore said. She stopped, turned. "Today in this room you did something your father would have done," he said. "You let the record speak, and you stood beside it, and you didn't ask for anything more than what the record deserved." He held her gaze. That takes more courage than most people understand. Because most people, after 7 years, would have wanted more than that. They would have needed the moment to be larger. They would have needed recognition or confrontation or something that felt equal to what they had carried. He paused. "You just needed the record to be right." She looked at him for a long moment. "That's what he taught me," she said. She walked out. The corridor outside was quiet. The morning routine of the unit was running around her operators, moving between assignments. Voices in the distance, the ambient sound of a building full of capable people doing their work. She walked through it and nobody stopped her and nobody watched her, and she was invisible the way she had been invisible since the day she arrived, and she let herself be invisible for one more hour before the 1100 briefing, because invisibility had served her well, and she was not ready yet to be something different. She had one more thing to do first. She went back to the records room. She sat down at the table where she had spent most of the last 9 days. She took out a single sheet of paper. She picked up a pen, the same precise and deliberate pen she used to annotate everything she documented. She wrote one line, record corrected, truth confirmed, Carter M. Then she put the pen down and sat with it for a moment. Just a moment, quiet and alone, and finished in the way that things are finished when you have done them right and the work says what it needs to say and you don't need to add anything to it. Then she stood up. She had a briefing to get to. She had an operation to rebuild. She had a team to bring home, and she was not done yet. The 1100 briefing was the first time Madison Carter sat at the center table, not because anyone told her to, not because Whitmore directed her there. She walked into the briefing room and the natural geometry of the situation placed her at the center because the clean intelligence pathway that Krebs had written on that notepad was her domain to interpret, and the structural anomalies she had documented over 9 days were her architecture to explain. And everyone in that room understood without discussion that the person who had built the case was the person who would lead the rebuild. Mitchell had arrived first. He was already in his usual seat when she came in. He watched her walk to the center position without comment, without reaction, with only the particular quality of attention that he now gave everything she did, which was the attention of someone who had stopped assuming and started observing. Danny Brooks came in 2 minutes later, saw her at the center table, and sat down to her left without hesitating. Hayes came in last, closed the door, and stood against the wall with his arms crossed and his face carrying the composed readiness of a man who had been waiting for this specific briefing for 31 years without knowing it. Whitmore stood at the head of the table. He said, "The November operation is not canceled. It is rebuilt. Lieutenant Carter leads the intelligence assessment. Every assumption in the previous package is considered void until re-verified against the clean source data." He looked around the table. "We have 10 days. We use all of them." He sat down. Madison put the notepad in the center of the table, Krebs's handwriting visible across the top of the page. She put her own documentation beside it. She looked at the room. "The original intelligence source is clean," she said. "Tessner's modification was applied at the certification layer, not the source layer. That means the underlying operational picture is accurate. What was corrupted was the framing around the critical decision points, specifically the entry vulnerability assessment in the communications blackout window." She pointed to the relevant section on the notepad. "Krebs's access pathway gives us the unmodified source data. Once we pull it and verify it against the original collection timestamps, we can rebuild the operational picture from the ground up." She looked at Mitchell. "I need your assessment of the entry vulnerability on the ground team side," she said. Clean eyes. No assumptions carried from the modified package. "Done," he said. She looked at Danny. "Communication architecture. The blackout window in the original package was extended by 4 hours in Tessner's modification. I need to know the actual window based on independent signal analysis." Danny nodded immediately. "I'll have it by tonight." She looked at Hayes. "Personnel," she said simply. Hayes uncrossed his arms. "The team is intact minus Krebs. His operational function can be redistributed. I'll have a coverage plan by end of day." She looked at Whitmore. He said nothing. He just nodded once, the nod of a commander who has handed the room to the right person and is done second-guessing that decision. The briefing ran for 3 hours. By the end of it, the November operation had a new skeleton. Not complete, not ready, but structurally sound in a way the previous version had never been, because the previous version had been built on ground that someone had deliberately undermined, and this one was being built on the actual ground, verified and re-verified by people who now understood that verification was not a formality, but a survival requirement. When the room cleared, Mitchell lingered. He waited until everyone else had filed out. Then he looked at Madison across the now empty table. "Tessner," he said. She had heard from the command contact at 1000. The formal investigation authorization had been served at Tessner's office at 945. His access to all active operational certifications had been suspended simultaneously. The administrative hold on the November package had been converted to a full freeze pending the investigation outcome. "It's moving," she said. "How long before the full investigation result?" Mitchell asked. "Months," she said. "Maybe longer. These processes don't move fast." "But it moves," he said. It was not a question. It was the same thing Whitmore had said earlier, and the repetition of it was not accidental. It was a man confirming something for himself. "It moves," she said. He picked up the notepad from the center of the table and looked at Krebs's handwriting for a moment. The clean access pathway, the information that had made it possible to rebuild. He set it back down. "He gave us a way forward," Mitchell said. "Krebs, after everything." "People are complicated," she said. "That's a generous way to put it." "It's an accurate way to put it," she said. "Generous would be forgetting what he did. Accurate is recognizing that what he did and what he gave us in the end are both part of the same record." She looked at the notepad. "The record holds all of it." Mitchell was quiet for a moment. Then he said the thing she had not expected him to say, not because it was surprising, but because It was so direct, and directness of this specific kind was something she had not received from him before. "I'm sorry," he said. "Not for the armory. You explained that. I understand that." He met her eyes. "I'm sorry for the first 30 seconds, before I threw the rifle. When you walked into that room and 14 people decided who you were before you opened your mouth." He paused. "That was wrong, not useful wrong, not accidentally wrong, just wrong. And I was the one who set the temperature in that room." She held his gaze. "Ryan," she said, using his first name the way she had used it in the vehicle bay, in the way that cost something each time. "The 30 seconds before the rifle was the same 30 seconds my father faced every time he walked into a room where someone had already decided what he was. He never got an apology for any of those moments." She paused. "The fact that you're standing here saying this to me means something. Not because I need to hear it, because the kind of person who says it is the kind of person this unit needs." She picked up her documentation from the table. "That's worth more than the apology." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Your father trained you well." "He did," she said. She walked out. The next 10 days were the most intense, sustained work period that most of the unit had experienced outside of active deployment. The operation rebuild consumed every available hour. Madison drove the intelligence reassessment with a precision and pace that left people struggling to keep up. Not because she was inconsiderate of the pace, but because the timeline was real, and she understood it with a completeness that made urgency the only appropriate gear. Danny worked 16-hour days on the communications architecture and delivered an analysis that was in Hayes' assessment 2 levels above what his experience and rank would normally produce. He found the actual blackout window, confirmed it against 3 independent signal sources, and built a redundancy protocol around it that gave the ground team a communications option they hadn't had in the original package. Mitchell rebuilt the entry vulnerability assessment from 0, as Madison had asked, with clean eyes and no assumptions carried forward. He did it with the systematic thoroughness that 15 years of exactly, well, this kind of work had given him. And what he found was that the original source intelligence was not only accurate, but operationally favorable in a way the modified package had specifically obscured. Tessner hadn't just framed the package to fail. He had hidden information that would have made the operation cleaner than anyone had realized. On the 7th day, Madison received a communication from the command contact. Rear Admiral Carl Tessner had been formally suspended from all duties pending investigation. His access to the command structure had been fully revoked. The investigation was an active process. The command contact had 3 additional cases under review that showed structural similarities to the pattern. Madison had documented cases from other units, other timelines that now looked different in the light of what had been revealed. She read the communication in the records room alone at 0600. Then she sat with it for a while. Tessner suspended. 22 years of building the mechanism of climbing through a system by using the system's trust against itself. And it ended in a communication delivered at 0600 in a records room on a naval base in Coronado, California, because a 28-year-old lieutenant had spent 9 days alone in a building full of people who didn't know what they were standing next to, and built the last piece of a 7-year case on the workbench of an armory where a sergeant had sent her as a punishment. Her father's voice in the low light of a kitchen evening, with a disassembled weapon between them. "The truth doesn't have a deadline, but sloppiness does. Do the work right and the truth takes care of itself." She put the communication down. She got back to work. On the night before the operation, Whitmore called a full unit assembly, not a briefing, an assembly which was different in this unit because it was informal. No agenda, no presentation. Just the commander and his people in the same room before something significant. The room was full, every seat taken, the ambient, low-level noise of a group settling. Whitmore stood at the front. He said, "Before tomorrow, I want to say something that doesn't belong in a briefing document." He looked at the room. 10 days ago, this unit had a compromised operational framework, an internal security breach, and a 22-year-old injustice embedded in its history that none of us knew we were carrying. He paused. Tonight, the operation is clean, the breach is addressed, and the record is in the process of being corrected. He looked at Madison, who was sitting in the 3rd row in a standard seat with no particular distinction around her. That is not the result of command decisions or institutional process. That is the result of one person doing the work right when nobody was watching and continuing to do it right when everybody was. The room was completely quiet. Lieutenant Carter, he said. She looked up. The decision about where you sit in this room tomorrow is yours, he said. You've earned every seat in it. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she said, I'll sit where the work needs me, Commander. The room stayed quiet for another 2 seconds. Then Mitchell said from the back, without ceremony, that's the right answer. And something shifted in the room. Not dramatically, not with a wave of noise or a theatrical moment. Just quietly the way real things shift. The way trust builds one honest exchange at a time over days of watching someone do what they said they would do and keep doing it without asking for acknowledgement. Danny felt it from his seat. The temperature of the room changing not from cold to warm, but from uncertain to settled. From a group of people who had been moving through a high-pressure situation together to a group of people who had been through something together and were still there and were ready for what came next. Hayes against the wall felt it too. He felt it the way you feel things after 31 years, which is without surprise, but with a specific gratitude for the moments when the work produces this. When the people in a room are more than the sum of their individual capabilities, because something real happened between them that made the sum different. The operation launched at 0300 the following morning. Madison was at the command coordination position. Not in the field, that was not her role, and she had never represented it as such. Her role was the intelligence architecture, the communications framework, the real-time assessment of the operational picture as it developed, and she filled that role with the same complete and unhurried precision that she brought to every task she had ever accepted in this building. Mitchell led the ground team. Danny ran the communications coordination. Hayes managed the personnel deployment, and Whitmore commanded. The operation ran for 4 hours and 17 minutes. At 0722, Mitchell's voice came through the communications channel. Objective secured, he said, team intact. Coming home. The command room exhaled. Not dramatically, not with a theatrical release of tension, just the specific quiet exhale of people who have been holding something very carefully and can now set it down because the thing that needed to happen has happened and the people who needed to come back are coming back. Madison sat at her coordination position for another 20 minutes running post-operational verification checks on the communications log, the intelligence assessment accuracy, the decision point timeline, confirming that what the operation produced matched what the intelligence said it would produce. Now that the intelligence was clean, it matched every critical decision point, every vulnerability assessment, every communications window. The original source was accurate. It had always been accurate. Tessner had not found a weak operation to exploit. He had found a strong one and deliberately made it look weak because a strong operation that succeeds doesn't produce a name for the false report. And a name for the false report was the entire mechanism. She closed the verification log. She wrote one final notation. Operational outcome confirmed. Intelligence assessment validated. Source data accurate. All critical decision points within predicted parameters. She signed it the way she signed everything. Carter M. 2 weeks after the operation, a ceremony was held on the base. Not large, not public. The kind of ceremony that happens inside classified environments, attended only by people with the access to be there, documented only in records that most people would never see. Whitmore stood before the assembled unit. He spoke about the operation, about the work that had rebuilt it in 10 days, about what the unit had found inside itself when a situation demanded something beyond standard capability. Then he said, there is a specific recognition that needs to be made today. Not for the operation, for the 9 days before it. He looked at Madison. She was standing in the third row. She had not been told to stand anywhere specific. She had arrived and taken a seat without calculation, and the seat she had taken was the third row in the middle, neither conspicuous nor invisible. Lieutenant Carter came to this unit without announcement, Whitmore said. She was given no welcome, no respect, and no consideration for what she carried or what she knew. She accepted every condition placed on her. She did work that was designed to defeat her, and she did it better than anyone in this unit could have done it. She identified a threat that would have cost lives and destroyed careers and continued a 22-year injustice. And she did all of it while allowing every person in this building to believe she was something much less than she was. Balmayim, Basabanchion. He paused. The strongest person in a room, he said, is not always the loudest. It is not always the most decorated. It is not always the person who has been here the longest or carries the most recognized name. He looked at her steadily. Sometimes it is the person who does not need the room to know who they are because they already know. And that knowledge in the right person is the most unbreakable thing in any building. The room was completely still. He walked down from the front of the room and stopped in front of Madison. He reached into his breast pocket and took out a single folded document. He handed it to her without ceremony because the ceremony was in the content and not in the gesture. She unfolded it. It was a formal command notation, a document that would enter the official record of Naval Special Warfare Detachment 7. It referenced the intelligence assessment, the operational rebuild, the security breach identification. It referenced the historical documentation submitted in support of the formal investigation into Rear Admiral Carl Tessner. And at the bottom, in a separate notation, it referenced the original mission from 22 years ago. It referenced the flagging report that had been reconstructed and authenticated. It referenced the formal submission for reassessment of the original mission record. And it said, in the precise language of official military documentation, that the record as submitted supported a finding of no individual fault on the part of the operator who had been assigned responsibility in the original post-mission review. No individual fault. Daniel Carter. Madison stood in the third row of a ceremony room in Naval Special Warfare Detachment 7 and held a document that said what her father had spent the last years of his life knowing and never hearing confirmed. She read it twice. She folded it. She put it against her chest. She did not cry. Not because she was suppressing it, because the emotion she felt in that moment was not sadness. It was not grief. It was something quieter and more complete, the specific feeling of a thing being whole that was broken for a very long time, the feeling that does not announce itself dramatically, but settles into you like warmth slowly from the inside out. Mitchell, standing 2 rows back, looked at the back of her head and felt something in his chest that he could not have named at 25 or 30, or even 35, but that he could name now in his 40s after 15 years of this work and the specific education of the past 3 weeks. He felt the weight of what it cost to be right about something for a very long time when nobody believed you. And he felt the specific quality of relief that arrives when the weight is finally officially set down. Danny Brooks looked at the document in her hands and thought about a man sitting across a kitchen table in low evening light, patiently teaching his daughter to trust her hands in the dark. He thought about what that man had carried, what he had tried to do and been destroyed for trying, what his daughter had spent 7 years building in his memory without shortcuts and without sloppiness, because the truth didn't have a deadline. I thought about all of that, and then he thought about the fact that he was 24 years old and had just participated in something that he would be thinking about for the rest of his career, not because of what it was in operational terms, but because of what it taught him about what this work actually was at its core. It was not the decorated mission. It was not the public acknowledgement. It was the long, quiet, disciplined work of making sure the record said what actually happened, because the record was what remained after everything else was gone. And if the record was wrong, everything built on it was wrong, and people paid for that wrongness in ways that ran forward through decades and across generations. Hayes, against the back wall, watched Madison hold the folded document against her chest and felt 31 years of this work settle into a specific and clear resolution. He had spent 3 decades believing that the system, imperfect as it was, moved toward truth over time. He had doubted that belief after the Carter mission. He had been carrying the doubt for 22 years alongside the archived copy of a mission document that he had kept because he could not make himself throw away evidence of something that didn't feel finished. It was finished now. The system had not moved toward truth on its own. It had needed a person to carry the truth through the system and refused to put it down until the system was ready to receive it. That was not the version of institutional faith he had started with, but it was a more honest version, and he was old enough now to value honesty over comfort. Whitmore stood at the front of the room and looked at the unit assembled before him. These people, his people, the people he had been responsible for and had nearly failed, not through negligence, but through the specific failure of trusting a system without maintaining the discipline of questioning what that system produced. He was not going to make that mistake again. He was not going to let the people in this room make it either. He said, dismissed. People began to move. Voices, the ambient return of normal. The specific sound of a room becoming itself again after a significant moment has passed through it. Madison walked toward the door. She was nearly through it when she stopped. She looked down at the folded document in her hand. She looked at the symbol on her left forearm, faded at the edges and permanent at the core, the mark that her father had carried and that she had earned the right to carry, the thing that represented not fame and not recognition, but the specific willingness to do the hard thing, without witnesses and carry the cost of it without complaint. She thought about the kitchen table, the low evening light, the patient voice. Do the work right and the truth takes care of itself. She put the document in her breast pocket close to her heart where it would stay until she could place it beside the other documents she had been carrying for 7 years, the full record complete. Now the way her father had always believed a record should be: accurate, authenticated, irrefutable, signed. She walked out of the room and into the ordinary morning of a naval base in Coronado, California, where the work was never finished and the next thing always waited. And she was already moving toward it because that was who she was and who her father had raised her to be. And the most important lesson either of them had ever carried was the one that never needed to be spoken aloud because it was written in everything they did. The truth doesn't need you to be loud. It doesn't need you to be the most visible person in the room. It doesn't need recognition or ceremony or the approval of people who didn't see you coming. The truth just needs you to do the work right and stay until it's done.